In October 1955, the MV Joyita set sail with 25 souls on board. 5 weeks later, she was found drifting in the Pacific. Listing at 45 degrees, her decks half submerged and completely empty. The radio was tuned to the distress frequency. A doctor's bag sat open, bloodied bandages inside. But every man, woman, and child had vanished. Not a single body was ever found. Tonight we go deck by deck through the ghost ship that couldn't sink, and the 25 people who abandoned her anyway. This is the mystery of the MV Joyita. There are places on this earth where the rules we take for granted simply stop working. Places where compasses spin, where radio signals die in the air, where the ocean doesn't just take, it erases. The South Pacific in 1955 was one of those places. Thousands of miles of open water, islands scattered like forgotten punctuation marks across a blue manuscript no one bothered to finish. Ships moved through this emptiness on schedules that were more like suggestions. If you left port on a Tuesday, you might arrive by Friday. You might not. And if you didn't, the ocean had a way of not explaining itself. November 10th, 1955. The merchant vessel Tupelo was making a routine run from Suva, Fiji to Funafuti. Captain Gerald Douglas, a man who'd worked these routes for years, stood on the bridge in the early afternoon heat, watching the horizon ripple in the thermal haze. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. That's the thing about the ocean. You spend so many hours staring at nothing that when something finally appears, your brain needs a moment to register it. At first, he thought it was debris, or a whale, or a trick of the light. But as the Tupelo closed the distance, the shape resolved into something unmistakable, a ship, dead in the water, tilted violently to one side. No smoke from the stack. No movement on deck. No flags. No signals. Just drifting. Douglas slowed the engines and brought the Tupelo alongside. The vessel was a twin-engine yacht, about 70 feet long. White hull, stained with rust and saltwater. The name painted across the stern in black letters, MV Joyita. He knew the name. Everyone who worked the Pacific shipping lanes knew the name. The Joyita was a charter boat that ran supplies and passengers between Samoa and the outer islands. Owned and captained by an ex-Royal Navy officer named Thomas Miller, a Welshman they called Dusty, the kind of man who wore his officer's cap even in port, who still stood at attention when the Union Jack went up at the harbour-master's office. But the Joyita wasn't supposed to be here. Not 600 miles off course, not abandoned, not listing so far over that her port deck rail was dipping in and out of the water with every swell. Douglas called for volunteers. 3 men from the Tupelo's crew climbed down into a dinghy and rowed across the glassy water between the 2 ships. The Joyita sat low, her decks awash. The port side nearly submerged. They tied off and climbed aboard. The deck was slick. Algae had started growing in the pooled seawater. Ropes lay coiled exactly where they'd been left, as if the crew had simply stepped away for a moment and forgotten to return. The hatch to the pilot house stood open. Inside, charts were spread across the navigation table. A pencil lay beside them. The last marked position showed the ship somewhere between Samoa and the Tokelau Islands, 270 miles to the north, exactly where she was supposed to be 5 weeks ago. But there were no navigators, no captain, no crew. One of the men descended into the companionway. The engine room was flooded. Seawater lapped at the bottom of the stairs, dark and oily, thick with diesel. Both engines sat silent and cold, but the port engine's clutch was still partially disassembled, parts scattered across the engine room floor, some already submerged. A toolbox lay open on the workbench. Whoever had been working on it hadn't finished, or hadn't had time to finish. They found food in the galley, rotted black in the tropical heat, crawling with flies. A pot sat on the stove, its contents unidentifiable. The stove was cold, had been cold for weeks. In one of the passenger cabins, they found a doctor's bag, leather, well made, the kind a physician would carry on house calls. It was open. The contents, scalpels, bandages, bottles of iodine, spilled across the bunk. And on the floor, crumpled beside the bag, were bloodied bandages. Not a lot of blood, but enough. Enough to know someone had been hurt, enough to ask who, and where are they now? The men from the Tupelo searched every compartment. 25 people had been aboard when the Joyita left Samoa. 16 crew, 9 passengers. They found none of them. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no notes, no messages scratched into walls or scrawled in logbooks, just absence. But they did find things that didn't make sense. On the flying bridge, the open deck above the pilot house, stretched a canvas awning. It was tied down carefully, blocking the sun, or blocking the view from above. The navigation lights had been covered. Not broken, not removed, covered, wrapped in canvas and tied shut, as if someone didn't want the ship to be seen at night. Mattresses had been piled against the superstructure in odd configurations, like makeshift barricades, and the life jackets, the bright orange vests that should have been hanging in the equipment locker, were gone. So was the emergency raft. In the radio room, the equipment was still powered on. The telegraph key sat in the neutral position. The receiver was tuned to the international distress frequency, 2,182 kilohertz, the channel every ship in the Pacific monitored. But the aerial wire had been damaged. Severed or corroded or torn loose in a storm, it was impossible to tell. What was clear was that the radio's effective range had been reduced to almost nothing. Maybe 2 miles. Maybe less. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 2 miles might as well be silence. If the Joyita had tried to call for help, no one would have heard. Captain Douglas stood on the deck of the Tuplau, staring across at the listing ghost ship. He'd been sailing these waters for half his life. He'd seen cyclones tear ships apart. He'd seen reefs gut hulls like fish. He'd pulled bodies from the water after collisions, after fires, after disasters that made sense, even in their horror. But this made no sense at all. The Joyita was still afloat. Damaged, yes, flooded, listing, compromised, but afloat. And according to the engineers who would later examine her, she was designed with cork insulation lining her hull. Even fully flooded, she couldn't sink. The people aboard would have known that. Captain Miller, ex-Royal Navy, a man who'd survived the war at sea, would have absolutely known that. So why would 25 people abandon an unsinkable ship in the middle of the ocean? Why would they take their chances in lifeboats that were never designed for open water? And where did they go? The Joyita was towed to Suva, Fiji, and secured in the harbor while authorities tried to piece together what had happened. The investigation would take months. The theories would multiply. Piracy, mutiny, attack, insurance fraud, mechanical failure, mass panic. Some of them would be plausible. None of them would be proven. And the 25 souls who vanished, they were never seen again. To understand what happened aboard the Joyita, we need to go back. Not to the moment of disaster, we'll never know that moment, but to the days before, to the man who captained her, to the debts he carried, to the delays that plagued the departure, to the decision made in failing light with a damaged engine and a schedule already in ruins, to leave port anyway. Because that's where the story really begins. Not with the ghost ship drifting silent through the Coral Sea, but with a man named Thomas Miller standing on a dock in Samoa, watching the sun go down, knowing he was already late, knowing he couldn't afford to wait any longer. Let's go back to October 3rd, 1955, 3 weeks before the Tuplau found her. Back to the port of Apia. Back to the last time anyone saw the Joyita with living souls aboard. Thomas Henry Miller was born in Cardiff, Wales in 1896. By the time he was 19, he'd joined the Royal Navy. By the time he was 23, he'd survived the First World War at sea, watching ships burn on the horizon, pulling men from oil-slick water, learning that the ocean didn't care about your flag or your rank or your prayers. He came out of that war the way a lot of men did, alive, decorated, and utterly unsuited for civilian life. For a while he tried, worked in shipping offices, managed cargo manifests, wore a suit and tie, and pretended the desk was a bridge. It didn't take. By the early 1950s, Miller had drifted, quite literally, to the South Pacific. He bought the Joyita in 1952 for a price that should have been a warning. She was a 70-foot luxury yacht, built in Los Angeles in 1931 for Hollywood director Roland West, who'd wanted something fast and glamorous for weekend trips to Catalina Island. She'd been fast once. By the time Miller bought her, she was neither fast or glamorous. She'd been converted into a patrol boat during the war, then sold as surplus, then passed through half a dozen owners who'd each tried, and failed, to make a profit. Her engines were temperamental. Her hull leaked. Her reputation in the Pacific shipping community was, to put it charitably, complicated. But Miller loved her. He ran her as a charter service. Supplies, passengers, mail, anything that needed to move between Samoa and the outer islands. It was hard work. The margins were razor-thin. The competition was brutal, and Miller was drowning in debt. By October 1955, he owed money to the harbour master, to the fuel depot, to the chandler who supplied his ropes and canvas, to the mechanics who patched the Joyita's engines more times than anyone could count. He needed this run to Tokelau. He needed the payment. He needed it to go smoothly. October 3rd, 1955 began badly. The Joyita was scheduled to depart Apia Harbour at noon on October 2. But by noon on the 2nd, the engines wouldn't start. Miller stood in the engine room, sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands, swearing in Welsh, while the chief engineer worked the port engine's clutch assembly with a wrench. The problem was the same problem it had been for weeks. The port engine's clutch kept slipping. It had been repaired in dry dock 2 months earlier, but the repair hadn't held. The engineer had warned Miller, told him the ship needed another week in port, told him the clutch needed to be fully rebuilt, not just patched. Miller had said they didn't have a week. They didn't have the money for a week. By the evening of October 2, they had the port engine running. Barely. Miller made the call. They would leave at dawn. They would make the run. The engine would hold. It had to hold. Around 5 a.m. on October 3rd, 1955, the Joyita cleared Apia Harbour and turned north. The cargo was aboard. Medical supplies, timber, empty oil drums, sacks of rice and flour, crates of canned goods. The passengers had boarded the day before. There were 9 of them. A government official from Tokelau, travelling with his wife and 2 young children, a boy 7 years old and a girl 11. They carried 2 small suitcases and a wicker basket of food for the journey. Dr. Alfred Dennis Parsons, a British physician relocating to the islands to perform an amputation and take over the medical clinic. He brought his doctor's bag, a trunk of supplies and a portable examination table that had to be lashed to the deck. 4 merchant sailors, experienced men, Pacific Islanders who'd made this run a dozen times before. And a young cook named Tanu Mafili, 19 years old, recently married. He'd signed on for the voyage because the pay was good, and because his wife was expecting their first child in December. He wanted to have money saved before the baby came. The Joyita's crew numbered 16. With the passengers, that made 25 souls aboard. The voyage should have taken 48 hours, maybe less if the weather held. 270 miles across open water. At the Joyita's cruising speed of 7 knots, they'd reached Tokelau by midday on October 5. The harbour master, a man named Williams, stood on the dock and watched the Joyita's crew cast off the lines. Years later, in testimony to the inquiry, Williams would say he'd felt uneasy, that Miller had seemed distracted, that the departure had felt rushed, but he didn't stop them. No one stopped them. Williams watched from the dock until the ship disappeared around the headland. It was the last time anyone saw the Joyita under power. The last time anyone saw Captain Miller alive. The voyage should have taken 18 hours, maybe 24, with 1 engine. But by nightfall on October 3, according to the best estimates investigators could piece together later, the port engine had failed completely. The starboard engine was still running, but barely, and at some point during the night the crew began tearing it apart, trying to salvage parts, trying to fix whatever had broken, trying to keep the ship moving. They didn't succeed. On October 4, the Joyita didn't arrive in Tokelau. The islanders waited. They'd been expecting supplies. They'd been expecting the doctor. They'd been expecting the government official and his family. No one was worried yet. Ships ran late all the time. October 5 came and went. Still no Joyita. Now people started asking questions. The harbour master in Tokelau sent a radio message to Apia. Had the ship left on schedule? Was there a delay? Apia confirmed. The Joyita had departed on the 3rd. She should have arrived by now. On October 6, the Joyita was officially reported overdue. The Royal New Zealand Air Force dispatched a search plane from Fiji. It flew the route between Samoa and Tokelau, low and slow, scanning the water for wreckage, for debris, for oil slicks, for any sign of the missing ship. Nothing. October 7, another flight, another search. Nothing. The search area expanded. 100,000 square miles of open ocean. The planes flew grid patterns back and forth, hour after hour. They found fishing boats. They found whales. They found drifting logs and patches of seaweed and the occasional piece of garbage that made their hearts skip before they realized it was just garbage. But no Joyita. By October 10, the search was called off. The official statement from the New Zealand authorities was brief and procedural. The MV Joyita, departed Apia October 3, bound for Tokelau, is presumed lost at sea. All 25 persons aboard are presumed dead. Cause of disaster, unknown. Location of wreckage, unknown. The families were notified. In Samoa, in Tokelau, in New Zealand, in Britain, people received telegrams, formal, regretful, final. Your husband is missing. Your father is missing. Your son is missing, presumed lost. We are sorry. And that should have been the end of the story. A tragedy, yes, but a comprehensible one. Ships sank. People drowned. The Pacific took what it wanted and gave nothing back. It happened. It would happen again. But then, 5 weeks later, the Tuplau found her, and everything changed. November 10th, 1955. When Captain Douglas and his crew boarded the Joyita, they weren't just stepping onto an abandoned ship. They were stepping into a crime scene without a crime, a disaster site without a disaster, a grave without a body. Let's walk through what they found, slowly, carefully, because the details matter. The Joyita was listing approximately 45 degrees to port. The portside deck was submerged. Water sloshed across the planks with every swell, but she was afloat. Critically, impossibly, she was afloat. The first thing the boarding crew noticed was the smell. Not death, not exactly, but rot. Decay. The thick, sweet stench of food gone bad in tropical heat, mixed with diesel fuel, mixed with salt water and rust and something else. Something organic and wrong. There was food in the galley, blackened, crusted, crawling with flies. A pot sat on the stove, its contents unidentifiable. The stove was cold. Had been cold for weeks. Someone had been cooking, and then stopped. The pilot house was orderly, almost unnervingly so. The ship's wheel was lashed in place, locked on a heading of roughly north-northwest. The throttle controls were set to low. The compass was functional. Charts were spread across the navigation table, held down by a brass sextant and a half-empty pack of cigarettes. The pencil position marks traced a route from Apia toward Tokelau. The last mark was dated October 3, departure day, showing the ship approximately 80 miles north of Samoa. After that, nothing. No storm warnings noted, no distress messages logged, no indication of what had gone wrong. The ship's log was missing entirely. In the radio room, the equipment told a different story. The radio set was functional, well-maintained, powerful enough to reach ships and coastal stations hundreds of miles away, under normal conditions. But the conditions weren't normal. The aerial wire, the antenna that should have been strung from the mainmast to the deck, was severed, frayed, hanging loose. Had it been cut, torn away in a storm, damaged by accident or sabotage? Impossible to say. What was certain was this: with the aerial damaged, the radio's effective range dropped from 500 miles to less than 2 miles. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, 2 miles was nothing. If someone aboard the Joyita had tried to send a distress call, it would have died in the air. Unheard, unanswered. A scream into the void. Below deck, the flooding was worse. The engine room was submerged up to the floorboards. Dark water, thick with oil, lapped against the bulkheads. The electric bilge pumps had failed, or been shut off, or run until the batteries died. Both engines sat silent. The port engine, the one that had been giving Miller trouble for weeks, was intact but cold. It had seized at some point, locked up, stopped turning. But the starboard engine, that was the mystery. It had been disassembled, not broken, not destroyed, deliberately taken apart. The cylinder head was removed. Parts were scattered across the deck. Pistons, valves, gaskets, some submerged, some floating in the oily water. A toolbox lay open on the workbench, wrenches still inside. Whoever had been working on that engine had done so methodically, carefully, like a surgeon performing an operation. But they hadn't finished, or they'd been interrupted. The passenger cabins were small, cramped, stuffy. Personal belongings were still in place. In one cabin, a woman's suitcase lay open on the lower bunk. Clothing neatly folded, a hairbrush, a small mirror, a photograph of 2 children, the same children who'd been aboard, smiling, squinting into bright sunlight. In another cabin, a man's jacket hung on a hook. The pockets held a wallet with identification papers for the government official from Tokelau. Cash inside, untouched. And in the cabin near the stern, they found the doctor's bag. Dr. Parsons' medical bag, black leather, brass clasps, the initials ADP embossed on the side. It was open. The contents dumped across the bunk: scalpels, forceps, a stethoscope, bottles of iodine and chloroform, rolls of gauze, bandages. And on the floor, crumpled, stained, bloodied bandages. Not soaked, not drenched. but marked, used. Someone had been injured. Someone had been treated. But there was no body, no blood anywhere else in the cabin, no sign of violence. Just the bandages, and the absence of the person who needed them. On deck, more strangeness. The canvas awning stretched over the flying bridge was tied down with deliberate care. The knots were sailors' knots, secure and professional. But why cover the flying bridge? In the Pacific heat, shade was valuable. But this awning blocked the view from above, from the air. As if someone didn't want the ship to be seen. The navigation lights, the red and green lanterns that marked the ship's position at night, were wrapped in canvas, deliberately obscured. Again, as if someone wanted the ship to be invisible. And the mattresses. 3 of them, pulled from the bunks below, dragged up onto the deck and stacked against the superstructure. Positioned like barriers. Like cover. Cover from what? The life jackets were gone. The Joyita carried standard-issue cork life vests, bright orange, impossible to miss. They should have been stored in the equipment locker near the pilot house. The locker was empty. The ship's emergency raft, a small inflatable designed to hold 6 people, was also missing. But here's the problem. The Joyita didn't have enough lifeboats for 25 people. She had 1 small dinghy, 1 emergency raft. If everyone had abandoned ship, where did they go? 25 people couldn't fit in a dinghy and a 6-person raft. Not safely, not in open ocean. Captain Douglas stood on the deck of the Joyita as the sun began to set. His crew had searched every compartment, every locker, every crawl space. No bodies, no survivors, just the evidence of 25 lives interrupted. He radioed the authorities in Fiji. "We found the Joyita," he said. "She's afloat. She's abandoned. Everyone's gone." There was a long silence on the other end of the radio. "Then say again, the Joyita. 5 weeks missing. We found her 600 miles off course. No one aboard. No explanation." Another silence. "Stand by. We're sending a cutter to tow her." The Joyita was towed into Suva Harbor on November 12. By then, the news had spread. The ghost ship of the Pacific. 25 people vanished without a trace. A floating mystery that defied explanation. The press descended. Photographers swarmed the docks. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in uniform. What happened? Where are the passengers? Was it pirates? Mutiny? A storm? No one had answers. Not yet. A formal inquiry began in February 1956. Naval architects examined the hull. Marine engineers studied the engines. Investigators interviewed anyone who'd known Miller, anyone who'd seen the Joyita before she sailed, anyone who might have answers. They found a corroded pipe in the port auxiliary engine's cooling system. It had failed due to galvanic corrosion. What happens when 2 different metals meet in salt water and begin to eat each other alive? The pipe failure allowed water into the bilges. Slowly at first, then faster. The bilge pumps had no strainers and had become clogged with debris. Once clogged, they were nearly useless. The water kept rising. The Joyita lacked watertight bulkheads. Once the flooding began, it would have gradually filled the lower decks. But even fully flooded, the cork-lined hull kept her afloat. She couldn't sink. Captain Miller should have known this. Any experienced sailor would have known this. So why abandon ship? The inquiry's final report was careful, measured, and frustratingly inconclusive. The evidence suggests a sudden emergency that caused the crew and passengers to abandon ship. The nature of that emergency cannot be determined from the physical evidence available. They noted the covered navigation lights. They noted the disassembled engine. They noted the bloodied bandages. But they offered no definitive explanation. The inquiry blamed Captain Miller for recklessness, for leaving port on one engine, for failing to maintain the radio, for not ensuring the bilge pumps were functional. But blame didn't bring anyone back. In the months that followed, theories multiplied. Theory 1. Catastrophic engine failure and panic. The official theory. The sequence would have gone something like this. The port engine seizes. The ship slows. Captain Miller orders the crew to work on the starboard engine, trying to keep at least one engine running. But the starboard engine also fails or begins to fail. The ship loses power completely. They're drifting now, dead in the water. The radio is damaged. They can't call for help. The ship begins to list as water seeps in through the open hatches. Someone gets injured, maybe in the engine room, maybe on deck. The doctor treats them. Hence the blooded bandages. Miller makes a decision. He believes the ship is sinking. He doesn't realize the cork insulation will keep her afloat. He orders everyone into the lifeboats. 25 people cram into a small dinghy and an inflatable raft designed for 6. They abandon ship. And then the ocean takes them. The lifeboats are swamped, overloaded, unstable. A wave capsizes them, or they simply sink under the weight. 25 people in the water. No rescue, no hope. Theory 2, piracy. Pirates operated in the Pacific. But modern criminals, smugglers, hijackers, men who preyed on isolated ships far from any authority. If pirates had attacked the Joyita, they might have covered the lights to avoid detection while they ransacked the ship. But nothing had been ransacked. The cargo was intact. The passengers' valuables were untouched. The cash in the wallets was still there. If pirates had attacked, what did they take? Theory 3. Japanese fishing fleet encounter. In 1955, Japanese vessels were operating illegally in the Pacific, fishing in protected waters using methods that violated international treaties. There had been tensions, confrontations, a few violent incidents. What if a Japanese trawler had encountered the Joyita? What if there had been a confrontation, a collision, an altercation? What if the crew and passengers had been taken aboard the Japanese vessel, either as hostages or as witnesses to be silenced? It was plausible, but there was no evidence. No damage to the hull suggesting a collision. No reports of Japanese vessels in that area at that time. Just speculation. Theory 4, mutiny. Miller was in debt. The ship was in poor condition. The voyage had been delayed. Tensions might have been high. What if the crew had mutinied? What if there had been a struggle? What if Miller had been injured or killed, and the crew had panicked? But there were no signs of violence, no blood except in the bandages, no weapons, no struggle marks. Theory 5, the night evacuation. In 2002, researcher David Wright proposed a scenario that accounted for most of the evidence. The flooding from the corroded pipe began after 9 p.m. on the second night of the voyage. In the darkness, the crew wouldn't have been able to locate the leak. The water would have risen gradually, unnoticed until it was above the engine room floorboards. By then, it would have been too late to stop it. The ship began to list. The remaining engine lost power. The lights went out. The clock stopped at 10:25 p.m., suggesting the electrical generator failed at that moment. In the darkness, with the ship listing heavily, someone tried to send a distress signal on the radio. They didn't know the aerial was damaged. They thought they'd sent the message. They thought help was coming. Miller made the call to abandon ship. He believed the distress signal had been sent. He believed rescue was imminent. He believed it was safer to wait in the lifeboats than to stay on a flooding listing ship in the dark. He was wrong on all counts. The lifeboats were overloaded, unstable, and in the open ocean, with no land in sight, they had nowhere to go. The theory fits. It explains the covered lights, rigged during daylight to provide shade while they waited for rescue. It explains the disassembled engine, attempted repairs before the decision to abandon. It explains the bloodied bandages, an injury during the chaos. It explains why they left an unsinkable ship. They didn't know help wasn't coming. But it's still just a theory. No trace of the 25 people aboard the Joyita was ever found. No bodies washed ashore. No wreckage from the lifeboats. No personal effects. Nothing. The ocean took them completely. The Joyita herself was auctioned in 1956, put back to work, ran aground twice more in the following years, was eventually abandoned on a beach in Fiji, stripped for parts, and left to rot. By the late 1970s, the last piece of her had disappeared. But the mystery remains. 25 people vanished from the face of the earth, not in a storm, not in a sinking, not in an attack. They left a ship that couldn't sink, climbed into boats that couldn't save them, and were never seen again. Why, we'll never know. The ocean doesn't explain itself, and some questions don't have answers. Just the silence of open water, and the ghosts of 25 souls who drifted into the void and never came back.